people having a Mother's Day. And you say, well, why didn't they have a Mother's Day? Calendars were dynamic. Dynamic means they changed, right? So if you go in the book of Genesis, it says it was Pharaoh's birthday. It probably wasn't his birthday. People didn't have birthdays. Why? Because some years had 13 months. Some years had 12 months. Some months had 35 days. Some months had 21 days. Whoa, what's going on here? They looked at what they saw and they adjusted their calendars to see what they saw. So it's very hard to have a fixed day. But the kings were different because the calendar was set for when he became a king. So the king was either took office on the day when the sun set in the east and rose in the west type thing, or either in the fall or the spring, because they named the year after the king. What year was it? Oh, it's the third year of King so-and-so, right? So you had to have a fixed day of the year for the king to start off, right? So they probably didn't have Mother's Day, but they had mothers, right? And they did take care of their mothers. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about Jacob. We're in the story of Jacob and his, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's, those people lived close to 4,000 years ago, different world than we do. And what I want to talk to you about, what happened to Jacob after he came to faith. And that's what we'd like to talk about today. Last week we looked at Jacob. He met his twin brother. Remember, he cheated his twin brother. And his twin brother said, one day I'm going to kill you. Right? And his twin brother was Esau, a different fellow than he was. It wasn't an identical twin. And so he was really worried. Remember, he wrestled with the Lord somehow, and he wanted to be a blessing. And somehow Esau and Jacob hugged each other and cried and kissed each other, and they didn't kill each other. And so he was very thankful. But he didn't follow his brother home. He said, he's got 400 men with him, and I'm going to stay a little bit away from him, right? And so then he ended up crossing the river, and he goes to a place called Shechem. And while he was there, he bought a plot of land. The Bible talks about a well that may have been dug there. And then his daughter was abducted, and two of his sons went and killed off the males in that town. Really nasty scene, And so this is where we are today. And remember, at the end of that, Jacob said, why did you do this? He said, the Canaanites might get all their forces together and attack me. And what am I going to do? They're bigger than I am, and they're going to kill me. But his sons replied, that why should they treat our sister that way? This is a topographical map. And, in a topographical map, you know what they are. You usually take, in a topographical map, the heights is not to scale, right? A mountain that's maybe a third of a mile high, it may look like it's 20 miles high to make you see, okay? So if we look at this thing, I don't know if you can see my mouse. This little river over here was where, can you see that mouse moving around up there? That's where Jacob crossed the river, right? And he met the angels, and he came downhill. He crossed this other river, the Jordan River, and he went over here. See the number 6 there? Yep. Okay, the number 6 would be close to Shechem, where he moved. And at Shechem, there's a ridge of mountains that goes, and if you ever go around, if you want to follow a ridge, you follow the ridge. It's easier to walk on a ridge line than it is to walk up and down valleys. You get on the ridge and away you go. And so that's how you go south. You get on that ridge line up, check them, you climb the mountains, get on the ridge line, you go all the way to Jerusalem. And that's where Jacob was at that point in our story. By the way, the rivers in there, some of the rivers, they're blue, but they only flow part of the year. Some of the places, we don't know what they look like in Jacob's day, because Abraham, when he looked down into a well-watered valley, doesn't mention a sea, where his nephew Lot was staying. But 400 years later, there's a sea there. What happened? Well, guess what? The world is dynamic. You know what that means? It's changing, isn't it? And it's changed quite a bit. And some of it changed back then, and some of it's changed since then. This is probably the place where Jacob lived near Shechem. The town over there to the side is about maybe a third larger than Vallejo. It's the town of Nablus, and it's in Palestine today. There are no Jews living in Nablus. They'd probably kill them if they lived there, you know. And but this mound out here is supposed to be the tomb of Jacob. Not Jacob, Joseph. I said it wrong, right? And inside there's a big stone sarcophagus, and this is where supposedly they buried Joseph later, right? And so this is some kind of idea of the terrain there where he was. Mountains change, they go up and down, there's lots of things change, there's lots and lots of earthquakes in this area, big crack in the earth that opens up and changes, so we don't know that it was exactly like that, but it had some similarity to that in those days. This is our famous picture that I like to show you every week about what people may have dressed like in those days. Now, have you ever heard of a coat of many colors? You heard of that, right? You see any clothes of many colors? How do you get clothes with colors in them? Well, you get different colored threads, right? And you weave them. You don't dye the whole clothes. You don't stamp them with a big stamp or something. You got to get the dye, and then you got to weave them and make patterns. Some of those ladies must have been pretty good at doing some weaving, right? And making cloth out of different colored threads and coming out that way. But this is the picture that we have of what people may have dressed like back in Jacob's day. So we are now in Genesis chapter 35. And we're going to skip 36, or we'll just briefly mention. But, Jacob said, then God said to Jacob, remember now he's at Shechem, that where the mountains were, where the road went on the ridge line went south. And he says, go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household, and to all who were with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves, and change your clothes. What does that tell you about Jacob's family? They were heathens, they were pagans, weren't they? So he married four women, and some of them had their gods with them. And now that Jacob is trusting God, he's realized, hey, God's taking care of me. He took care of my brother, he took care of my uncle, he took care of my flocks when my uncle was trying to steal all my stuff. Right? He's kept his promises to me. I believe him. He really has kept his. So Jacob had faith. He had faith much like you have faith. But it was a different. The object of his faith was God's promises, but they weren't the same promises you and I have. Right? We believe Jesus died for us. And when he died for us, he forgives us and makes us his children. That wasn't the promises that Jacob had. Right? But still, God was able to declare people righteous because they believed his promises. And so what's Jacob doing here? Saying, you pagan wives of mine, we're not going to be that way anymore. Right? We're going to turn around. And so what's he doing? True faith is something that you don't hold inside. Right? If you have real faith, what are you going to do? You're going to tell other people about it. Why? Because it's true. It's something you know is true. Right? And so they then came to come and let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I've gone. So he's saying, hey, the Lord's taking care of me. Really nasty things could have happened, but God kept his promises that he was going to be with me, and he was going to do these things. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had, and the rings in their ears. And Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. By the way, you notice sometimes rings were in the nose. You know, Rebecca got a ring for her nose when she met so there was, but exactly why the rings in their ears was a bad thing, I mean, we don't know, but maybe they were gold or whatever. He said, no, we ain't playing that game anymore. And he dug a hole and he buried all this stuff. And he says, we're not going to have these foreign gods with us. My family is going to worship the Lord. By the way, did that mean everybody straightened out right away? Did all Jacob's kids all of a sudden become wonderful people who did only what was right and followed God to their great extent. No. Not really. But you know what's interesting? God can bring people to faith, even if it takes decades. And that's the wonderful thing about salvation. Nobody deserves it. Nobody deserves it. And yet, he can do it. He can. When someone comes to real faith, it wasn't you, it wasn't somebody who manipulated you, it was God who did it. So be thankful, because he can do it even to Jacob's family. This is a big oak tree, the kind of tree that they had in those days. And the Canaanites tended to have the worship of gods under the trees. That was if you read in the Bible, there's groves of trees, and they had idols and stuff under the groves. It was a big deal. They called some of these trees, they called them oaks of Mamre, oaks of wisdom. We're going to learn when we're under these trees. And some countries today, some people today, they ask permission before they go under a great tree. Right? Please, big tree, I'm coming under you. Be nice to me. I'm not going to do anything bad to you, because they think the tree is hearing or something. I don't know, but pagans can do some weird stuff. But then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. And Jacob and all the people who were with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, and in the land of Canaan. And there he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel, which means God, the God of the house of Bethel. Right? The house, Beth means the house. God, his house is the house of God, which is because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. So they get to this place, Bethel, and there he builds an altar, and he's going to lead his family to say, hey, we are going to worship this God who's promised not only me, but he's promised you guys. You're my children. He's promised you we're going to do something with his family. Now Rebecca's nurse died and was buried under the oak outside Bethel. So his name, Alon Bekuth, means the oak of weeping. Now, that's a really weird statement, because we haven't heard about her name before. And what was she doing there? A nurse in those days was not like a registered nurse that worked in a hospital. Right? Some nurses, there was a nurse for Moses. Moses' mother was not only his mother, but she was his nurse. Right? Then she got paid to nurse the baby. Right? That's a pretty interesting story, isn't it? About how the princes of Egypt hired the mother to take care of the baby. Some nurses were just like ladies who took care of babies. Now, what was this woman doing? Well, she's got to be at least 110 years old at this stage. She's not a young lady. Rebecca was Jacob's mother. So this was a lady that was probably around the age of Rebecca, who helped him. Maybe she was the lady who helped. He was kind of like a second mother to him when he was growing up. It was a lady who took care of him when he was little. And what's she doing with him? How did she get there? Did she go back home to where she come from to take care of her parents? She got old and Jacob was taking care of her? We have no idea. The story doesn't tell us. Our imagination can run wild, right? How did this lady, Rebecca's nurse, why doesn't it say anything about Rebecca? Doesn't mention Rebecca, who was the mother, Jacob's mother. Doesn't say anything about her. It says about the nurse. And she died, and they buried her there in this place. And so why is that important? Well, the story isn't continuous. There are little spots here and there that this is an important thing to say, and this is it happened here, and then we're going to go on from there. And so God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. So again, he's given him the same promises he gave to Abraham. By the way, what right does God have to give land to somebody else? Ever wonder about that? I mean, what does he have a right to do that? And it's interesting that this little tablet down here is a piece of clay, and on that clay there's an alphabet. And the alphabet is the Canaanites had more than one alphabet. And this is the alphabet of a town called Ugarit, which is up on the border. It's a sea-coast town up there where Syria comes down into Lebanon. And this town, they had the same language as some of the other Canaanites, but they had a different alphabet, and they wrote on clay. And guess what? If you write on paper or you write on leather or something, it's going to rot away. But if you write on clay, it has a tendency to stick around for a while. Right? So we have their records from this town of Ugarit, and we've deciphered their alphabet, which, by the way, it went from left to right, whereas the Hebrew alphabet went from right to left. And they also had 2 or 3 letters in there that, if combined with other letters, could sound like a vowel. Possibly the first use of vowels in an alphabet. Right? By the way, when you went to school, did you learn phonics? Where did we get the word phonics? The Phoenicians, who were they? They were Canaanites, weren't they? Eventually, some of the Phoenicians invented an alphabet. The Greeks borrowed their alphabet. They ended up with vowel signs in them, right? Where did we get our alphabet? Where did the Romans get their alphabet? Eventually came from some of these Canaanite people who were Phoenicians, who was one tribe of them. So, but what's interesting about this is we have their records, and their records were horrible, how they murdered little babies and slaughtered them in honor of their God. It was really horrifying things. Today, things that we would just say, you know, even the nastiest people around, if you start slaughtering little kids, that's considered to be about the worst thing you could do. These guys did it in honor of their gods, and they did it publicly, and they did it together. Does God have a right to take care of them and say, I'm taking away your land, I'm giving it to somebody else? God is not unjust. He doesn't do wrong things. He doesn't rush to judgment. But there comes a point where a nation or a group gets to the point where God's going to have to move. You think we might be close to that point?
Yes.
It could be, isn't it? But we know that God is just, and he's going to take care of business. So, okay, in verse 13, then God went up from him in the place where he had talked with him, and Jacob set up a stone pillar at that place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it, and Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel, the house of God. Again, this is the same place where he had been when he put his head on the stone, and he had this dream at least 20 years before, maybe 30 years before, we're not sure how long. Because their stories weren't told the way our stories are. They told them at different important places. Now, this is the place that is possibly the place of Bethel. Now, if you go in biblical history, you find that Bethel became a place where they had a golden image of a calf. Remember that? There was a guy named Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was a king, and he set up a golden calf. And they went to Bethel and they worshipped it. Now, nobody really can be sure what Bethel is, but it's interesting that there was one of the early Christian historians who says this is where Bethel was. And he says Bethel was by the 12th milestone from Jerusalem. And they found the 12th milestone because the Romans would put a stone up every mile. And their miles was 12 of our miles would be about 11 of theirs. So it's close to ours. And they found the stone, and it's right next to this place. So this may be the remnants of this place where Jacob where he went up to this place and set up this altar. We don't know anything about it. It was ruined since then. Other people came in and destroyed it. But this may be the place at the top of this hill where he had brought his family and said, we're going to worship God together. And then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were still some distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. And she was in severe labor, and the midwife said to her, do not fear, for now you will have another son. Remember who Rachel was? That's the girl Jacob really loved. Remember? He said those 7 years that he worked for her, they seemed like days to him because of his love for this girl. He really loved her. And what happened? His uncle cheated him. Remember that?
Yes.
Can you imagine something more that make you madder after you work 7 years to marry this girl and you end up with the wrong girl? I mean, but that was some of the stories of Jacob that got him into some pretty weird things. By the way, when God made the woman from the man, she didn't make him from his head. She didn't make him from his feet. She made him from his side, right? She was supposed to be his companion, and he made them to be soulmates. And the first law he ever made, before there were any women or babies or anything, he said, the two shall be one. Remember that? And before there were any children. And so God had a plan originally. Jacob didn't exactly follow that plan, did he? It didn't say the four will be one, did it? And so he had a lot of problems in his family, and some of them were because he probably didn't understand that God originally had him planned that, right? But this was what happened to his family. Now his favorite wife, now she's giving birth. And it came about as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. Ben-Oni means the son of my sorrows. You know, this is the kid that killed me type thing. But his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrathah. That is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her grave. That is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. So when this Genesis was written, there still was a place there of this place. This is an image from maybe 100 and some years ago. There was a British couple who I think were Jews. They went to Rachel's tomb and they built a dome structure over it to celebrate her, because they called her Mama Rakal. You know, she was the mother. She was the great mother. She's the, you know, think about Mother's Day. She's the mother of us, right? And today it looks like this. They have big concrete walls all around it. They have armed guards all around it. If you go there to visit Rachel's tomb, you're going to go in an armored bus, right? And you're going to have armed guards, because the people of Hebron they'd like to tear the place down, right? And but people still go there because they consider this is the mother of the nation. We need to honor her, and they take their life in their hands to go to Rachel's tomb. Isn't that interesting? Because she was an important person. She didn't live that long, right? And that's not uncommon that women died in childbirth. And but here she is. She's being honored. Jacob's heart's broken because the girl he really loved, that he didn't care about the others, he only cared about her, she ends up dying first, you know. And so he from then on, Jacob always seems to be in a kind of a despondent. Oh, my favorite wife died and left me with these two boys, and you know, it was a rough situation. But anyway, then Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond. Now he's close to Bethlehem, on the road to Bethlehem. She died, that's where they buried her. And he pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder, and Migdal Eder means the Tower of the Flock. Now in ancient times they would build towers, sometimes in a field. And if you, let's say you planted grapes, you might have somebody up there to make sure they didn't steal your grapes at night during the grape season or something, right? Or you would put a little tower up there to kind of protect your field. Because people didn't live on farms in those days. People lived in town. And so your farm was outside of town. And so during certain parts of the year, you might need to, but this one was a tower of the flock. And it's very interesting because it's mentioned in the Bible in the book of Micah. It says, as for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it will become, even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. What's the tower of the flock got to do with that? Well, it's right next to Bethlehem, right? And in Micah chapter 5 it says, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. Some people think that the tower, we don't know where Jesus was born. The Hebrew word for manger, we usually have little manger scenes. It could mean that it was a stall. Right? And so some people think that, how did the shepherds know where to go? They said, well, over there, these were special shepherds. We have records from ancient time that right around Jerusalem, there were special shepherds. The shepherds were considered to be really bad people because they worked on Saturday. You know, that would be a real bad thing to do, because how can you if you're taking care of sheep, you've got to take them to water, you have to take them to pasture, and so they weren't keeping the Sabbath. But they needed sheep for the daily sacrifices in Jerusalem. And some people think this tower that was next to Bethlehem, that's where Jesus was laid when he was born. We don't know. But it's an interesting theory because ancient people didn't have barns. Why didn't they have barns? They didn't live on farms. What did you do with your animals? You brought them into the courtyard of your house, right? So you ever smell a barn? Maybe the house smelled a little bit like that. But you brought some of your lambs, your favorite animals, your donkeys and stuff might live in your house in the town, and you take them out during the day to pasture or whatever. And so what happened to, years later, almost 2,000 years later, a baby was born in this town. And what was the significance of this? Why do they say he stopped at this tower and he pitched his tent there? Well, we don't know, but it's interesting. The Bible talks about the tower later. And Jesus was born in this place. Now, did Jacob know that? I don't think so. Did Jacob understand that part of the promises God gave him had to do with the Savior who's going to come and be born and die in our place? I don't think so. I don't think he understood that. But God's got a plan, and he's bringing it to pass. And it came about while Israel was dwelling in that land that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Did nasty things happen to these boys? Were they nice guys? If you sold your brother, would you be a nice guy? These are some bad dudes, aren't they? Why in the world would God save bad people? Ever wonder about that? Did he save you and I? Who does he save? Jesus came and he said, I came. The doctors don't go to the well people, they go to the sick people, right? Jesus came to save sinners. Isn't that a wonderful story? If you have put your faith in Jesus, that he died for you, that's a personal thing. He saves you. He brings you to make you his child. Based on what? On faith. Based on faith in what? Not on your works, not on your prayers, not on your promises or anything. Based on his promises that he did it for you. That's a personal thing, isn't it? You don't do that because your dad did it. But yet, your dad can teach you about it, and someday God can train him. Now, here's the layout of his kids. Now there were 12 sons of Jacob, the sons of Leah. There were 6 of them: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were 2, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maid, Dan and Naphtali, 2. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's maid, Gad and Asher. So there's 12. And these are the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Pandan Aram. Pandan Aram means, remember, Abraham's brother was Aram. Haram means and Pandan Aram means the fields of this guy, Haran, right? This guy. He was the father of the Arameans, who you read about later in the Bible. They had wars with him, right? And so here they are. They're born to him in this place. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre of Kiriath-Haim. We don't know how long it took him to get there. This is Hebron, where Abram and Isaac had journeyed. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. Know anybody that has lived 180 years? You know anybody that came even close to 180 years? If you live half of that, you're considered to be doing pretty good, aren't you? So here's old Isaac. He's been blind for at least 30 years, maybe 40 years. So he probably didn't get blind because he was old. He probably got blind because he got a disease or something, right? And now the days of Isaac were 180 years. Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. An old man of the right age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried. So we don't know how long this happened, but it probably happened about 20 years or so after Jacob got to the land. Remember, the story is in a jump around. They get a little high point here and there. We would tell a story, we want to tell it all linearly, and we want to make it all in time. They didn't do that because the concept of time didn't arrive until a couple hundred years after the Bible was finished. And so they had a completely different way of looking at things. They looked at change. They didn't have verb tenses like we do. They didn't even know how to talk like we do. So this is the end of him. Now think about this place. And later on, when Jacob is dying, he tells him where to bury him. He says, the cave that is the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite for a bare site, there they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. So now we find out that Leah died somewhere along the line, and he buried her in this cave. Here's a picture. Can you see that hand coming out of the ground? That's a little girl. She's 12 years old. There's a hole in the ground that's 11 inches in diameter. You know, you try to crawl through an 11-inch diameter hole, a lot of people can't make it. But this girl was skinny, and in 1968, after the 1967 war, there was this Jewish officer, and they captured this place where it's supposed to be, where the cave is underneath. There's a structure that was built over it by Herod the Great, and being revised and modified, earthquakes, all kinds of things that's happened in the last 2,000 years. They gave her a rope and they dropped her down the hole. 12-year-old girl, skinny little kid. Down the hole she goes. She had a flashlight, she had some matches. He said, strike the match. The match goes out, it means no oxygen, you come back up, right? And she had a camera. Probably in those days it was kind of a little brownie camera, you know, little clicker type thing with a flash go. You remember those? And so she goes down the hole and she maps it. She takes pictures of it and she maps it. So we have an idea of what this cave was like. And there were tombs down there, graves down there. Whose are they? Probably Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Leah, and Rebekah. Right? They're down there. And they found bones down there. Right? So this is a very interesting place. This girl grew up to be a professor, and she's very famous because she's the one that went down and explored the cave. Today, the building is divided right half. Pretend this half is Muslim and this half is Jewish, and they can't cross the middle line, and the Jews are only allowed to come up 12 steps and then have to stop, and you know, because they're trying to make peace and not kill each other, right? Which is not always easy to do in that place, right? And but this is the tomb of Isaac, who lived 180 years. Wow. Later on, we get to Moses. Moses lived 120 years. His brother lived like 126 or 24. His sister lived 123 or something, you know. And so then Moses, he says it's only going to be 70 years. If you live longer than 70 years, he says, you're probably going to suffer. Remember, that's in Psalm 90, right? Interesting thing. He lived 120 years. But people don't live 120 years today, do they? Interesting, isn't it? They lived in a different age when things were a lot different. I'm going to throw this in just to keep you honest here. This is the map of the Mediterranean Sea. And you see the brown areas? They're dry. In those days, the Atlantic Ocean was a lot lower. Jean, she could have walked from England to France. All right? Because the English Channel was dry. They had rivers there. They had forests out there and stuff like that. Weird, isn't it? And Jacob, this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. Job, he says, you know, man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. And then he says, you know, it's really rough. And he uses the word for west, which is the name for the Mediterranean Sea. And he said the Mediterranean dries. What a terrible life we have. We don't live long. The Mediterranean dries. Is that weird? Can you think that way? Doesn't make sense to you, does it? But it did dry. And scientists who claim they understand it, they said it filled up again 5 million years ago. Job couldn't have lived 5 million years ago. According to the Bible, he lived like 5,000 years ago. This, Job also says, he says, water wears away the rocks of the earth. And they've dug down and drilled holes in the bottom of the Nile River, and the Nile River at Cairo was deeper than the Grand Canyon and much wider than the Grand Canyon. Does that make sense to you? How did that wear down that rock? It did it when the ocean was dry, because the water ran downhill down to a mostly empty ocean. Is that weird? Think about it. Old man Isaac, he lived 180 years. Was his years like ours? Well, here's the other thing Job says. He says, God continues to radically change our faces. And he used the Hebrew word for face. And he uses a word for continuous. And he used the word for intensity. He says our faces intensely change, and then God takes us away. If you lived long enough to watch an ocean dry, guess what you'd grow? Neanderthal eyebrows. You would become a Neanderthal. Was Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, were they Neanderthals? I don't know, but it would be interesting to figure out if we could go down that hole and go look and see whether their skulls had thick brows or not. It would be interesting to me. I'd like to ask that girl that went down there, did you see any skulls? Right? Anyway, that's what we've been dealing with here. I got out of whack here a little bit. Hang on just a second. When Jacob when Jacob got to be about 90, most of the story happened beginning about 90 years of age. He's going back home. Remember, he didn't get married until he was in at least his 60s, right? And he finally came to really believe God's promise about him and his family. And he struggled, asking God to bless him. And he begins to teach his family that they would have faith in God's promises. Didn't happen right away. Can God save people who are bad? Really bad people? Does he do it right away? Sometimes it takes decades. But if he promises he can do it, he can do it. Let me tell you, he can do it. And eventually, if we're going to continue this series, we're going to get into the story of Joseph. I'm not a very emotional person, but when I read the story of Joseph meeting his brothers, I always get tears in my eyes. Do you? That's a tearjerker, isn't it? Because it's a very, very interesting story. Joseph, a very important character in the Bible. He's like Jesus in many ways, right? And but now he begins to teach his families. But it didn't immediately happen. Some really bad things happened, but even the bad things that happened, God didn't make them happen, but he used them for good. We learned that later on in this book. And remember, this is not Romans 9. It says, "For though the twins were not yet born," which twins? Jacob and his brother Esau. "They done nothing good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand. Not because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated." God makes choices. He makes choices. If you have put your faith in him, you couldn't have done it unless God had something to do with it. You can't con somebody into faith. Real faith comes by believing God, and it comes from God's word. And it isn't because somebody had a better way of giving a more exotic type of message that maybe they use a lot of social media or a lot of music. It isn't that way. It's you believe God's word. And so you can't manipulate someone to have real faith. And yet real faith is a personal thing. You personally came to trust Jesus. It's not your family. It's not your mother and father. I believe Jesus died for me. On that basis, he says, you're my children. I'll never leave you. I'll never forget you. I'll be with you. Someday when I come back, I'm going to give you new life. Isn't that wonderful? Where did it start? Some of it started back there almost 4,000 years ago when God calls Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to faith. True faith can't be hidden. If you have true faith, can you say, well, I'm not going to tell anybody about it? There's a problem, isn't it? If you really have faith, it should affect your life. May not do it right away, but it should affect your life. It should affect how you live. And not only that, you want to tell other people about it. This is an important thing. You can know God and have peace with him and know that he saves you. You can do it. So when we go around Jacob, what did Jacob do? He goes out, he right away says, hey, my kids, we're going to throw away those idols and we're going to start worshiping the real God. Didn't happen right away. Because those boys still did some really nasty things. But in the end, Jacob shares his faith. Decades later, his sons came to appreciate what their father had taught them. Didn't happen right away. By the way, we get to the New Jerusalem. The Bible talks about the New Jerusalem up in heaven. There's a bunch of 12s in the New Jerusalem. There's 12 foundations. There's 12 apostles that are written on the 12 foundations. There's 12 gates, 12 pearls. Each gate is a pearl. 12 angels. And the gates all have names. What are the names of the 12 gates? The 12 tribes of Israel. Did God save those people? Even though they were nasty boys. You know, they sold their brother. I mean, could you get any worse than that? Can God save bad people? Isn't it good that he does? And so there, by the way, there's also 12 months. They haven't got any moon and they haven't got any sun, but there's 12 months. How do you know whether they're 12 months? 12 kinds of fruit on the tree, one each month. So they can count months and they can count years, because if they count to 12, it says it's another year, right? So no sun and no moon, but 12 is a big number up there in the New Jerusalem, and one of them is those 12 boys, some of them who were pretty nasty people, you know, did some really horrible things, things that are immoral, and some side even genocidal, a lot of nasty things they did. God ended up giving those guys faith. Isn't that wonderful to know? Do you have faith? Do you trust God? Jesus died for you. He paid for your sins. Put your faith in him. You can never be ashamed if you do. He will take care of you because he did it. He did it for us. All right? By the way, think about this. We've gone through Abraham. There's 14 chapters of Abraham. 25 through 12. By the way, if you subtract 12 from 25, you don't get 14, you get 13. How come it's 14? Because the last chapter is included, isn't it? There's 14 chapters for Abraham, only 2 for Isaac, 8 for Jacob, Esau's family, which we're going to only briefly mention in chapter 36. Then there's 14 chapters for Joseph. Joseph's a pretty important guy. I really like Joseph. He's a really amazing fellow. Because one of Jacob's sons really ended up faith at a young age. And that's pretty interesting. We'll do that again, hopefully, next month. Kurt?